Hello there, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're safe and well. And in this video we're going to be looking at the little tips for when you set up your scope on your rifle to make sure that you get the best alignment and the best accuracy that you possibly can. So let's roll the intro. Here we go then. Today we're talking about tips for when you install your scope to make sure that you do the best job you possibly can and you get the best accuracy out of your rifle. I'm not going to go over fitting the scope. Simple reason, there are plenty of videos on YouTube already of how to do that. So if you want to see how to do that, just do a quick search. I'm just going to go over some little tips and things along the way. Got my list down here to work my way through. So the first thing I want to talk about is the cheaper scope mounts. And I did mention in a previous video that it may be false economy to buy cheap mounts. Okay, so I just wanted to go into some of the reasons why you might find that cheap mounts might not do the job. They're cheap because they're made of cheaper materials and a cheaper manufacturing process. So what you may find is that the pieces aren't built to the greatest of tolerances, and therefore the first thing you might find is that the mounts actually don't line up. So if you've used cheap mounts to mount your scope and you find that you're having to put a lot of clicks on your turrets to try and sight your scope in, and sometimes even running out of clicks, it will be probably because your mounts don't line up. So in that case, what you might want to try is taking the mounts off, twisting them around 180, or even switching them front to back to see if that makes any difference. That's the first thing. Second thing, you'll find that the good quality mounts, they don't have any like pads or anything inside to compensate. The hole is perfectly round, so you know when you torque them up that you're not going to damage the tubes on your scopes, whereas cheaper ones tend to have these little sticky pads in, and just looking at the front, you look at them and they don't look perfectly round. So that's another reason, you know, once you torque them up, you could squash the tube on your scope. Also, you might find as well that the material is not so resilient. The bolts, the top of the bolts, when you're using an Allen key, they might round out easily because the material is not that great. And also, when you try and torque them up, you might find that you even strip the threads in them because of the quality of the material. So that's a few things to consider. And why I'd recommend that you pay the money. I mean, scopes are not cheap, so it's worth splashing out and getting a good set of good quality mounts. So that's cheap mounts. Next thing you need to consider, obviously, when you get your mounts is the height of the mounts. How do you determine whether you get low, medium or high mounts to mount your scope? Well, a lot of that is going to have to do with, firstly, how high the block is on your gun. Normally what you'd want to do is get the objective lens as low to the barrel as you can. So that's one of the first things to consider, that you want the objective as close to the barrel as you can normally. It's not always the case, but generally that's what you'd want. Also, you've got to look at being able to get the right eye alignment. If you haven't got an adjustable stock for your cheap piece and your scope mounts are too high, you're going to have problems trying to get the correct eye alignment. Now, it is important that when your cheek is resting on the cheek piece on your butt, that your eye is aligned with the exact centre of the scope. So if you use too high amounts, be achievable. If you've got an adjustable cheek piece, then fine, doesn't really matter because you can adjust that up and down. If you do get too high amounts and you haven't got an adjustable cheek piece, it isn't the end of the world because you can buy these pads, like foam pads and stuff that you can fit on, elasticated pads and stuff that you can fit on to raise that up to overcome that. But it's something worth thinking about when you get your scope rings in the first place. The other thing you need to consider as well is if you've got a gun with a magazine, the gap between the scope tube and where you fit your magazine in needs to be tall enough for you to actually fit the magazine in. So that's another consideration. So you've got your rings on. One of the things that you want to be aware of as well is if it's a good idea, if it's achievable, to get as much width on your rings as you can. You don't want them too close together. You want to use the full, as much length of the rail as possible. So you're using the full length of tube on your scope to get a much sort of secure fitting of the scope to the gun. That way you're less likely to lose your zero if the scope gets knocked or the gun gets knocked. Okay. So you can see on this rifle, this is a Air Arms S400 with a Hawk scope. You can see that I've set the rings on here quite wide apart. Another thing to consider when you're deciding on where to put your rings is if you've got a side focus scope, generally the focusing mechanism is just forward of the turret posts here. So this first sort of half an inch, that's where the side focus mechanism is. Now you might find on some scopes, typically on Hawk scopes I've had this, if your front ring is too far back and too close to that nest of turrets, once you've tightened it up, you will find that your side focus gets very stiff and it doesn't work properly. So it's always a good idea, just to be safe, to make sure that you've got plenty of clearance from your front ring in front of your turrets so that you don't interfere with that side focus mechanism, if that's what you've got on your scope. Right, let's talk about eye relief. Eye relief will be designated on the specification for the scope, and what eye relief is the normal distance that you would set up between your eyepiece and your eye. Typically common around sort of a 3-inch type mark. So what you want to be able to do is, well, not be able to do, it's essential that when your cheek, when you're shouldering the rifle, or when the butt's in your shoulder and your cheek is correctly sitting on the cheek piece, you need to be able to adjust the scope forward and back before you finally tighten the rings up to make sure that the eye relief is perfect. This is all part of a thing called gun fit that we will talk about in a later video when we start talking a little bit more about accuracy and making sure your gun is accurate as it can be. But for now, what you need to do is to ensure that you've got that correct distance between your eye and the eyepiece of your scope so that you get the right scope picture. I'm going to put up a little graphic over the top here to show you that if your eye relief is correct, when you look through the front of the scope, you should be able to see a solid black circle around your reticle with no fuzziness. Should be a little bit of black space around the outside. So you look through your scope and follow that round with your eye, and you should be able to see solid in focus circle all the way round. If you can't see that, if it's too small or it's, you know, all you're seeing is reticle and you can't see that circle, then the distance isn't right. So you need to make minor adjustments. Now you might need to ask somebody to help you with this, and what is important with this as well is that you set up your eye relief in the position that you would normally be shooting your rifle. So if you're going to be mainly target shooting from a bench, then you want to be sitting at the bench with your gun in position, and you move and adjust your eye relief. If you're going to be shooting mainly prone, which is lying on the ground, then you need to do that in that position. For the simple reason, you'll find that the position of the rifle is slightly different in those positions. The eye relief changes slightly between when you're lying prone and when you're sitting upright on a shooting table or a desk. Okay, so remember that one. So we've covered that. We're going to look at leveling now. One of the things to look out for. A lot of the videos that I see, what they say, you know, they just deal with using spirit levels to level the scope. So you'd fit one spirit level on the top of the stock or on the flat part of the block, and then you need to fit another one for the scope. First thing I would say is don't expect the top of the turret covers to be okay to put your level on. A lot of them are curved, like on this. It looks flat, but when you put the level on, it actually spins around. So what I would suggest, just to be certain, is take your cover off your turret if you've got turret covers, and you will find that inside it should be flat. So then you can be sure that you've got your turret level. But another thing on this as well is, if you're leveling purely with spirit levels, then I would highly recommend that once you've set this up, that you check your vertical reticle alignment with a plumb bob. Okay, what's a plumb bob? Basically, plumb bob, bit of string. This is my plumb bob, got a little loop there. I've got a nail in my shed, so I can hang it up on the shed. And this, when it settles down, gives you a perfectly vertical reference. So when you're looking at this, your vertical part of your reticle should be perfectly aligned with this. If it's not, then your turrets are not straight, and you'll need to make your adjustments with reference to a plumb bob. The reason I say this is because I have had two particular scopes from a manufacturer that I won't name, the same scope, and then I got a replacement scope, and on both of those, when I levelled them up using spirit levels, the vertical part of the reticle was canted off either to the left or right, quite significantly. So I had to set the scope up with a plumb bob and not the spirit levels to line the reticle up. Funny thing was, say, exactly the same experience with the same scope, two completely different scopes, and it did the same thing. So I would highly recommend that you check it against the plumb bob, because that variation from the vertical is what we call cant. Okay, and one of the things when it is lined up, one of the things that you need to try to be sure to do when you're shooting is ensure that you're actually holding your rifle and it's upright and it's not canted to the right or left. Now, in some disciplines, they allow you to actually fit a spirit level that is visible either to a ring or one that fits on your dovetail or your Picatinny rail. Some rifles even have one that's attached to the front and folds out. That's not allowed in HFT, but it is in the other disciplines, and the reason they have that is so that when they're taking aim, they can glance quickly at the spirit level and see that the bubble's in the middle, so they know they're holding their rifle perfectly upright and it's not canted. Okay, I will show you in another video when we get into it a bit further the reason why you don't want to be canting your rifle when you're shooting, how that will affect your point of impact on your target. But for now, just need to know that that reticle needs to be perfectly upright. So make yourself a plumb bob and check it out and make sure it's right. Okay? Save yourself a lot of grief later on when you wonder why you're doing your best and you can't hit the ball and you find out that your scope's not aligned properly. Right, last but not least, when you tighten up the rings, you want to be very careful, because if you over tighten these rings, not so much the bolts on your on the block, but certainly the bolts on the rings holding the scope. If you over tighten them, you will crease or damage the scope tube and might even write the scope off. So you need to be very careful. So most of you are probably going to be using Allen keys. So the golden rule, when you're using Allen keys on a scope, is that you always use the long end to tighten up and twist the short end. You don't use the short end to tighten up and twist the long end, okay? When you're using the long end and you've got the short end on the top, because there's not much leverage on there, unless you're built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, you're not going to be able to put enough torque on those bolts to damage your scope, okay? So you should be tightening that up just finger tight until you can't tighten that anymore. Obviously, if you use the short end, you can see you've got so much leverage on that there that you can quite easily over torque it, okay? If you want to go the whole hog to make sure that you're setting your rings and the attachments to the block at the correct torque, this is a card that comes with a set of sport match mounts, and they give you the torque settings on the back here. Recommended torque settings: ring screws for 4mm thread, 15 pounds, dovetail clamp screws 4mm thread, 38 pounds, and they give you the 5mm ones and the Picatinny rail settings as well. Okay, so if you want to use those, get yourself one of these babies. This is a little torque screwdriver. You wind the little pin in at the top and there's a readout. This one is in Newton meters, so I have to convert the inch pounds to Newton meters. And you set that up, and then when you get to the correct torque setting, it will just click, and you know that you've set the right torque. Now what I tend to do is, because I'm not sure exactly how accurate these are, what I tend to do is, say for the ring screws on here, 15 pounds, that's 1.7 Newton meters. So I would set this at 1.4, 1.5 and click it out on that. That's more than enough. The dovetail clamp screws, this one on here, these can be 4.3 Newton meters, which is a hefty old torque. So I never go that much. I mean, most of the time on those bolts, I would set them to say 2.5 or 3, and that's more than enough, even on a Springer. So that's torque setting, and I think I've been rambling on long enough now. So that's all I've got for the moment about setting up your scope. And in the next video, what we will be looking at is determining how we're going to start, adjusting our zero and deciding on our magnification and the side focus if we're going to be shooting in HFT. So see you on the next one. Thanks for joining me. Hope you've enjoyed this. If you found this interesting, then please give us a like, because as I mentioned before, that if you click the thumbs up button, then it's more likely that this video is going to turn up as a recommended video for other people on their YouTube accounts. Means that other people that might enjoy this will get to see it. And if you want to be informed about when the next video comes out, then click the subscribe button, totally free, doesn't cost you a thing. It really helps me out on the channel. And hit the notification button and you'll be notified. So, thanks for watching again. Look after yourselves and see you on the next one.